everybody. Um, I'm beginning now the 10th video in the series, and I think I've got a lot of information to cover in this video to try and help you make sense of what's going on in any journey of transformation or journey of recovery. And it is tricky. Um, so, the first thing I want to do is just very quickly review what's gone on so far as the history of addiction, the suffragettes, the 1920s jazz age, Bill Wilson. And what we have in society, certainly through to the present day, is beginning with the religious Protestant Christian temperance movement, the revivalist movement, where they tried to teach everybody in North America that drinking was a sin. And that created this sort of subconscious idea that if you drank, you were a sinner and you must seek forgiveness. And that sort of mental attitude is still pervasive today. And by the time we got around to 1920, there was all kinds of problems being experienced with the 10 million Americans that were addicted to opium through laudanum, about 6 million of whom were women. There was a problem with the suffragette movement, not a problem with the suffragette movement, but there was a problem that the temperance movement piggybacked on to the suffragette movement. And there was always some question about whether or not drinking alcohol was a sin. And there was always some debate about the moral self-righteousness of Protestant Christianity. But that gained some legitimacy because it was attached to the suffragette movement. And then we have the 1920s and speakeasies and the definite shift in the expressions of sexuality carried into the Depression by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith, creating the idea of recovery from alcoholism, which had been a new idea. A lot of people understood that alcoholism was actually some form of aberrant mental condition. But Bill Wilson offered a Protestant Christian evangelical approach to the 12 steps, which required the seeking of forgiveness and the admission of wrongs with the implication that this was a sin. And of course, that was a logical result of how he and Bob Smith were raised through the temperance movement and the suffragettes. And we're left in the early 1940s with this idea that you can recover from alcoholism if you become good Christians and admit your moral turpitude and seek forgiveness. But the confusing part was that Bill wanted to create the notion this was also an illness or a disease. Now, he more or less referred to it as an illness. Which brings us up to the war on drugs and the recreation of the government enforcing a morality on the people of the community in the United States. The war on drugs immediately made criminals of drug addicts. And this set us back in the process of recovery, Narcotics Anonymous, through to the modern times. So when people are seeking recovery, they have to understand that the depth of their shame or guilt for being addicts comes from three different sources. The first source is they feel ashamed or guilty from the way that they see their acting out or destructive behavior. They think they're bad people. And I cannot tell you the number of times, millions of times, that I have heard addicts and alcoholics talking to me in my private practice or listening to them in recovery meetings where they accuse themselves of being bad and irresponsible and horrible people, which means they don't understand that this is an illness, no different than schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So there's a definite source of shame and guilt that comes from their own self-perception of themselves. Another source of shame comes from the society at large, where they persecute addicts as being bad, rebellious, and defiant people. And society thinks that there's some kind of moral corruption involved with being an addict. And if the addict would just kind of smarten up and do what they were told, be responsible and grow up, well, everybody would just be better off. And that's because they misunderstand the illness. And then some shame and guilt comes from dysfunctional families of origin where shame is imposed on them by poor caregiving and poor parenting. So when you're an addict and you're trying to seek some form of spiritual life, you have to remember that not all the shame and guilt is generated in your family of origin, and not all the shame and guilt that you feel is generated in you by your perception of your behavior. I think that the biggest problem I've ever encountered in addicts and alcoholics is this terrible confusion between them wanting to believe that they have an illness and the social and emotional persecution and religious persecution that somehow they're sinners and just bad people. So, in my two books, the ones behind me here, the blue book is the Addiction Recovery Handbook, and the green book is Spiritual Transformation. Both of these are available on Amazon.com, and they're available through the publisher's website, friesenpress.com in Victoria. But anyway, in these two books, I go into this in some detail. And the other things I touch on in the book that are, I suppose, a little bit too detailed and complicated for this, I may get around to them later, is this thing called repetitive inadequacy, which is a prominent condition in the minds of addicts and alcoholics who are struggling to get sober or to create a spiritual lifestyle. This is largely misunderstood, and it must be addressed in recovery, in early recovery. The second thing I talk about in the books that I won't really have time to get into in any detail is a thing called concordant affinity. And this is a mindset, this is an attitude that comes out of the traditional Theravada Buddhism. And the only place I've ever heard it talked about is in Buddhism. Now, certainly there may be other counselors or therapists or people who have happened upon concordant affinity and they don't really understand it. But concordant affinity is the way that we maintain long-term adherence to spiritual principles. I may get a chance to talk about that later. And so, 2 videos ago, I think it was 2 or 3 videos ago, I talked about the disease of addiction. It is a pathological relationship with a mood-altering experience that has life-damaging consequences. Then in the next video, I spoke about the 2 categories of symptoms of addiction. And the first category is, of course, social symptoms, and those are the symptoms that we display that are easily available for people to witness. And they are self-harm or harming others, the dishonesty and withholding. There's a certain amount of arrogance and superiority which conceals a deep-rooted insecurity. There is selfishness, where addicts spend a lot of time believing that there's the center of attention. The center of attention is for 2 main reasons, which I talked about earlier. And the last one is that they are defiant and argumentative. And then in the last video, I talked about spiritual principles, and there are 5 of them. And the 5 spiritual principles are: do no harm to yourself or others, always be rigorously honest, veracity in a kind and compassionate way, seek out some kind of social humility where egalitarianism and equality is the fundamental principle of your existence. The 4th one is be charitable of spirit and generous and kind, be compassionate. And the 5th one is be responsible and obedient to the first 4 spiritual principles. So that brings us to this video now, where we have to try and understand the process or the connection between the symptoms of addiction and spiritual principles and how you get from one to the other. And there are various programs like the SMART program and other sort of psychological based programs that don't really have a structure to them. They meet regularly the people that are choosing to participate think that they're in recovery, and they're just general conversations about how their life is going, but there's no real formal structure. And then standing opposed to that are the 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Emotional Anonymous. They all have this sort of structured 12-step program that the members are encouraged to participate in, to accomplish. And the reason for the 12-step program is to teach people things about themselves and their personality and their addiction. And so I'm going to hold up that chart again that I held up before, and I'm going to focus now on this center column, which is told you to disregard. So this is a little bit of what we're up against. If you can see from the chart, on the left side are the social symptoms of addiction, and on the right side are the principles of a spiritual lifestyle. Now, if you haven't noticed it before, notice it now. The social symptom of self-harm and harming others, the first social symptom, is actually the opposite of the first spiritual principle. If you're hurting yourself and harming others, you cannot be spiritual. The trick is to figure out how to have respect for oneself and others and do no harm. So the spiritual principle of having respect for oneself and others is exactly the opposite of the first social symptom of self-harm and harming others. The second social symptom is dishonesty and withholding, and the second spiritual principle on the right is rigorous honesty with veracity and kindness. We must always be appropriately honest in a kind and compassionate way. The third social symptom of addiction is arrogance and acting superior, and the third spiritual principle is humility with social egalitarianism. The fourth social symptom of addiction is selfishness, and in a spiritual lifestyle, the fourth spiritual principle is charity and generosity of spirit. And the fifth one, on the left column of social symptoms, is defiance, blame, and irresponsibility. And the fifth spiritual principle is being responsible and obedient and complying with the first four spiritual principles. So you can see now that the social symptoms of addiction are the exact opposite of the five spiritual principles. And the journey of recovery is to go from the left column, the symptoms, to the right column, spiritual principles. Now, the relationship between the symptoms of addiction and the sort of behaviors of a spiritual lifestyle, how you get from one side of the chart to the other, how you go from being an addict to being spiritual, is dependent upon you undergoing a rigorous series of self-awareness exercises. The self-awareness exercises are generally referred to by me as the psychology of the steps. Every time you do a step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through, each one of them has a specific psychology that sits within the exercise. So we'll just pick one at random. Let's take step 4. Step 4 is you're required to make a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. And this is largely misunderstood when people are doing it. Step 4 is not supposed to be a list of the bad things that you did. You know, you list how many fights you got in and how many banks you robbed and how many times you got divorced and how many times you had to declare bankruptcy. Step 4 is not a list of the bad things you did. It's a list of your moral values. And your moral values in step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory, is more to identify where you were lying, where you were disrespectful, where you were insecure, where you blamed other people, where you were irresponsible, so where you lied, where you were dishonest. It's an inventory of your morality, not an itemized grocery list of all of the bad things you did. So, doing the psychology of the steps, going from the social symptoms of addiction to spiritual principles, requires a very specific process. And this is one of the problems with the sort of general conversations in meetings or SMART programs or LifeRing or these various other programs where there isn't a specific structure of transformation. This is why the steps, what I called them earlier, this is why the steps are called homework assignments. The homework assignment is for you to go home and read and study some passage about addiction to learn something about yourself so that you can change the way that you view the world, so that you can change your emotional makeup in relation to your participation in the world. So how you go from the left side of the column, the left column on the chart, to the right column on the chart is you understand and complete, usually with supervision and help, you understand and complete the steps and the psychology that's required within them. So, as I said way back in one of the earlier videos, in the back of your mind, be aware that yes, there's 2 or 3 million people in traditional 12-step programs, faith-based treatment. But you always have to remember that there are 350 or 400,000 atheists and agnostics that are completing the steps, that are quite successful in their recovery, and they're maintaining stable, spiritually principled lives. Now, what this means is that they too have done some program of transformation. They put themselves back in kind of spiritual school to understand what they have to do to go from the symptoms of addiction to the principles of spirituality. It is entirely possible for people who are non-believers, who are agnostics and who are atheists, who do not believe that God exists, it is entirely possible for them to live a spiritually principled life. If you recall me talking about the 5 spiritual principles, I never said anything about God or higher powers. And in the symptoms of addiction on the left side of the chart, I never said anything about God or higher powers. What we have to understand that takes us out of the traditional, or takes us away from the traditional view of addiction, is that addiction is not a God deficiency. Addiction is not a God deficiency. It's a corruption in the way that we think and view the world because of the psychological symptoms that exist underneath the social symptoms. So the way that you go from the left side of the chart to the right side of the chart, the way that you actually recover from the symptoms of addiction and create a spiritual lifestyle is by completing a series of exercises of self-awareness where you are devoted to changing the way you think and perceive the world. And I'll be explaining that in much more detail as I go through the videos on the 12 steps. A friend of mine from years and years ago, who I worked together with for a number of years, Leonard Shaw, talked about that most people think life is a 2-step dance. Something happens and you get angry. Something happens and you get depressed. Something happens and you react. And most people think that there is nothing in between an event occurring. Somebody breaks into your car and you throw a hissy fit and you're outraged. Somebody says something you don't like and you react angrily and you fight back. This is the way most people think that life is. It's a 2-step dance. But really it isn't. Life is a 3-step dance. Something happens, you get a flat tire. Something happens, you get a speeding ticket. Something happens and somebody breaks into your house. There is an instantaneous evaluation in your mind. and you evaluate the incident as good or bad, and you evaluate it as important or not important. So you will react differently to your basement flooding because of a rainstorm. You will react differently to that than you do to stubbing your toe on the foot of your bed. The three-step dance is something happens, and then you evaluate it as to its importance, you evaluate it as to its urgency, you evaluate it in relation to your values, and then you react. And the purpose of the 12 steps is for us to understand that third step dance, the three-step dance, that there is this thing that happens in between an event and a reaction, and I can choose the way that I want to respond or react to life. Well, the point of the 12 steps, the psychology of the 12 steps, the point of the psychology of the 12 steps is to change the way I think about the world, the people in it, and my participation in it. It's to change the way I think about what an addiction is. And if I get the 12 steps done properly, in the sequence that they're outlined, I will eventually end up living by spiritual principles. And explaining all of this is the remaining videos. I want to talk to you about the two kinds of addiction, the two categories of addiction. I want to talk to you a little bit about, I'll give you a little bit more about repetitive inadequacy. When I get around to the maintenance steps, 10, 11, and 12, I'll explain a little bit about what concordant affinity is. And you should have a clear understanding that it's the psychology of the steps that will get you from the symptoms of addiction to spiritual principles. It's the psychology that gets you from one side to the other. So anyway, thank you for listening. Have to close this off now, and I will get another video uploaded fairly soon. Thank you.